"Stop me when it's too much," he'd whispered, and she never did. She should have. A woman with her past broken, rejected, wearing scars both visible and hidden beneath her skin had no business letting an alpha king court her with whispered confessions in empty kitchens before dawn. She should have said no the first time he asked to simply exist in her presence. Should have turned away when his amber eyes found hers across a room full of people and made her feel seen for the first time in 2 years of deliberate invisibility. But her wolf silent since the night another alpha's hands had shattered more than just her ribs woke up the moment his scent filled the palace kitchens. And it whispered one impossible, devastating word: mate. She'd rebuilt herself from nothing, learned to suppress every instinct that marked her as Omega. Buried her healing gift so deep that using it felt like tearing open old wounds, and convinced herself that safety meant never letting anyone close enough to hurt her again. She was the head cook, invisible, untouchable, free. Then he walked into her carefully constructed life and asked, never commanded if she'd let him stay. She should have known that a man who ruled a kingdom full of vipers would have enemies willing to destroy anything he loved. Should have realized that her past wouldn't stay buried forever. That someone at court would recognize the rejected Omega hiding behind kitchen grease and common cotton. She should have known that gentle kings and broken Omegas don't get fairy tale endings. But when he murmured, "Stop me when it's too much," with his forehead pressed to hers and his hands trembling with the effort of not claiming what his wolf insisted was already his, she couldn't. She'd never been very good at self-preservation anyway. This is the story of how a woman who'd sworn never to trust an alpha again learned that the strongest bonds aren't the ones fate forces on us. They're the ones we choose despite every reason to run. But to understand how she came to love a king who offered her everything she was terrified to want, we need to go back to the morning it all began. The coronation feast would begin in 4 hours, and Mira's kitchens were already behind schedule. She moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, checking the roasted pheasants browning over the open hearths, directing 2 apprentices wrestling with a massive pot of honey-glazed carrots, inspecting the delicate sugarwork meant to crown the king's ceremonial cake. Steam filled the air, thick with the scent of rosemary and butter, and the sharp tang of wine reducing in copper pans. Her hands never stopped moving, adjusting temperatures, correcting seasonings, salvaging a sauce one of the younger cooks had let split. No one noticed her. That was exactly how she'd designed it. Mira had learned long ago that survival meant making herself unremarkable. She kept her copper-brown hair pulled back in a severe braid, wore the same plain gray dress every kitchen servant favored, and moved with the kind of brisk competence that discouraged conversation. The palace staff knew her as efficient and private, nothing more. They didn't know that beneath the kitchen grease and common cotton lived Lady Mirabelle Ashford, a noble's daughter who was supposed to be dead. They didn't know about the white scar hidden along her jawline, or the 3 ribs that still ached when the weather turned cold, or the Omega scent she suppressed every morning with a bitter herbal potion that tasted like punishment. They didn't know that 2 years ago, an alpha had rejected her in front of his entire pack and beaten her badly enough that everyone assumed she'd died of shame. She preferred it that way. "Mira," Sarah's voice cut through the kitchen noise, bright with panic. "The king's here." Mira's hands stilled on the ladle she'd been using to taste the venison reduction. "What?" "The king. Sarah gestured helplessly toward the kitchen entrance. "He's coming to thank the staff personally. He's already spoken to the scullery boys. And oh gods, he's almost here." The room shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every cook, every servant, every apprentice turned toward the archway where the Alpha King of the Ironmore Kingdom had just appeared. Mira felt him before she saw him. The air pressure changed. Her skin prickled with awareness. And deep in her chest, something that had been silent and still for 2 years suddenly stirred. Now. She gripped the edge of the work table, forcing herself to breathe normally. She'd taken her potion this morning. Her Omega scent was suppressed. She was invisible, unremarkable, safe. King Theron Blackwater moved through the kitchens with careful formality, thanking each servant by name. He was younger than Mira had expected. barely older than her own 25 years, with black hair that fell past his collar and amber eyes that carried a bone-deep exhaustion. He wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, and when he smiled at the nervous scullery maid stammering her gratitude, the expression didn't reach those tired eyes. He looked lonely. The thought arrived unbidden, and Mira crushed it immediately. She didn't care about the king's emotional state. She cared about finishing this feast and returning to the blessed anonymity of her quarters. But he was getting closer. Sarah elbowed her sharply. "Stand straight, he's almost—" Theron stopped in front of Mira's station. She looked up. Their eyes met. The world tilted. His scent hit her first pine and smoke, and something darker, wilder, that made her wolf press suddenly against her thoughts like it was waking from a long sleep. The bond she'd spent 2 years suppressing flared to life without warning, and she felt it like a physical pull in her chest, drawing her toward this man she'd never met. No, this wasn't possible. "You're the head cook," Theron said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected, rougher, like he'd been shouting orders all day and had nothing left for ceremony. "Yes, Your Majesty." Mira forced the words out evenly. Professional, detached. "The feast will be ready on schedule." "I'm sure it will be." He studied her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. "I wanted to thank you personally, the coronation." He paused, and something flickered across his face. Grief, maybe, or guilt. "It matters that it's done well." "You're welcome, Your Majesty." She kept her tone flat, courteous but empty of deference. Most servants would have bowed lower, smiled wider, offered some flowery expression of loyalty. Mira gave him nothing. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in curiosity. Behind him, near the archway, a silver-haired man in expensive robes watched the exchange with casual interest. Lord Cassius, the king's chief advisor. His smile was warm, but his cold blue eyes tracked every movement like a predator assessing prey. Mira looked away first. "If that's all, Your Majesty, I have a feast to finish." For a heartbeat, Theron didn't move. Then he nodded slowly. "Of course, thank you again." He left. The kitchens erupted into excited chatter the moment he disappeared through the archway. Sarah grabbed Mira's arm, gushing about how handsome the king was, how kind, how different from his brutal older brother. Mira barely heard her, because deep in her chest, her wolf silent and traumatized since the night Rowan Frostborn had shattered her ribs and her faith in fated bonds, had opened one eye and whispered a single, devastating word. "Gentle." She gripped the work table harder. Her hands were shaking. No. She couldn't do this again. She'd rebuilt herself from nothing specifically to avoid this. The vulnerability, the hoping, the inevitability of being broken when the bond turned sour. She wouldn't survive it a second time. She would avoid him. Stay invisible. Let whatever her wolf thought it sensed fade into nothing. But that night, after the feast had been served and cleared and Mira had finally retreated to her small quarters near the kitchens, a palace page knocked on her door. He handed her a sealed letter bearing the king's crest. Mira's stomach dropped. She waited until the page left before breaking the seal. The message was brief, written in a strong, slanting hand. "I would be honored if you would join me in my study this evening. There are matters I'd like to discuss." TB1 stared at the letter for a long moment. Then she found a scrap of parchment, dipped her pen in ink, and wrote 4 words in reply. She folded the note, walked to the page station, and handed it to the night messenger with instructions to deliver it directly to the king. Then she returned to her quarters, barred the door, and tried very hard not to think about amber eyes and the way her wolf had stirred for the first time in 2 years. The note she'd sent was already on its way to the king's chambers. The first: "I'm not interested. Respectfully, stay away." 3 days passed without incident. Mira told herself she'd won. The king had received her note and respected her boundaries. He hadn't summoned her again, hadn't appeared in the kitchens, hadn't sent another messenger. The coronation festivities had concluded. The palace had settled back into its usual rhythms, and Mira had returned to the blessed anonymity of her work. She should have felt relief. Instead, her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, searching for a scent that was no longer there. Mira crushed the feeling ruthlessly and focused on kneading dough for the morning bread. The kitchen was quiet at this hour just before dawn, when most of the staff were still sleeping and she could work in peace. Her hands moved through the familiar rhythm, folding and pressing, finding comfort in the simple task. She stepped out into the courtyard to fetch water from the well. The king was waiting. Mira stopped so abruptly she nearly dropped her bucket. Theron stood near the stone wall, alone in the gray pre-dawn light. No guards flanked him. No advisors hovered nearby. He wore simple dark clothing instead of his royal regalia, and his black hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked exhausted. Lonely. "Your Majesty." Mira forced the words out evenly. "Is something wrong?" "No." He shifted his weight, and the movement was almost nervous. "I'm not here as your king." She waited, her fingers tightened on the bucket handle. "I'm here as someone who would very much like to know your name." His voice was different from the one she'd heard in the kitchens 3 days ago. Softer, tentative, nothing like the authority he wielded in the throne room. The vulnerability in it caught her off guard, and she found herself answering before she could think better of it. "Mira. Mira." He repeated it like he was tasting the sound. "Thank you." She should leave. Walk back into the kitchens, close the door, pretend this conversation never happened. Instead, she stood frozen, watching him watch her. "I received your note," Theron said quietly. "I understand you want me to stay away. I'm trying to respect that. But..." He paused, and something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe. Or resignation. "The council chambers are very empty this early, very cold. And I find I can't think clearly in rooms full of people who want things from me." Mira's chest constricted. She recognized the loneliness in his words because she'd lived it herself for 2 years. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, keeping her voice flat. "I'd like to work in your kitchen." The request came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing it. "I wouldn't bother you. Wouldn't speak unless you spoke first. I'd just..." He gestured helplessly. "Sit in the corner with my correspondence. Exist in a space where no one wants anything from me except the bread to be ready on time." It was the strangest request Mira had ever received. Kings didn't sit in kitchens. They didn't ask permission from servants. They certainly didn't admit to loneliness with such raw honesty. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Theron met her eyes, and the amber gold of his gaze was devastating in its sincerity. "Because you're the only person in this entire palace who doesn't want something from me." The truth of it hung between them. Mira felt her carefully constructed walls trembling, and she hated him for it. Hated him for seeing through her invisibility. Hated him for being gentle when every instinct she'd developed told her power and gentleness couldn't coexist. Her wolf whispered. "Safe. Fine." The word came out sharper than she intended. 1 week. "If you get in my way, you leave." Relief washed across his face. "Thank you." Mira turned and walked back into the kitchen without another word. She heard him follow, his footsteps careful and quiet. He chose a corner near the hearth out of the direct flow of work, but close enough to feel the warmth. He pulled a stack of sealed documents from the leather satchel he carried, and settled onto a wooden stool with the kind of focused stillness that suggested this was a practiced routine. Mira returned to her dough, hyper-aware of his presence despite her best efforts to ignore it. He kept his word. He didn't speak. Didn't ask questions. When Sarah arrived an hour later and nearly dropped a tray of eggs at the sight of the kings sitting in their kitchen, Theron simply nodded a greeting and returned to his work. When the other cooks filtered in and began their morning tasks, he made himself smaller, shifting his stool to give them more room. He was trying so hard not to take up space. It was the opposite of every alpha Mira had ever known. The morning passed in strange, quiet companionship. Mira found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. She noticed the way his shoulders curved inward, like he was trying to protect something vulnerable. The way he flinched slightly whenever footsteps approached too quickly. The bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. The loneliness radiating from him had a scent pine turning to ash, winter settling over a dying fire. Her wolf pressed against her thoughts. Hours. Mira shoved the feeling down and focused on checking the ovens. The next morning, he was there again, and the morning after that. By the 5th day, she'd stopped jumping when she found him in his corner. By the 6th, she'd started leaving a cup of tea beside his papers without comment. He never acknowledged it directly, but she noticed he always drank it. On the 7th morning, Mira finally broke the silence. "Why do you keep coming?" Theron looked up from the letter he'd been reading. His amber eyes found hers across the kitchen, and for a moment he seemed to be weighing how much truth he could bear to share. "Because when I'm here, I feel less alone." The honesty of it stole her breath. Mira turned away before he could see her expression shift, before he could see the way his words cracked something inside her chest. Her wolf whined. "Want him." She couldn't do this, couldn't let herself soften toward a king whose very existence threatened every wall she'd built. But when she glanced back at him, she found him already returned to his work, giving her the space to retreat without pressure. The sound of bells ringing in alarm shattered the quiet. Mira's head snapped up. The bells were coming from the throne room. 3 sharp peals that meant emergency, danger, evacuation. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Poison gas. Someone released poison gas in the council chamber. Taryn was already moving, but Mira's body reacted faster than thought. While everyone else turned toward the exits, toward safety, she ran in the opposite direction. Toward the throne room. Toward the danger. Toward the king who the 500th just left her kitchen and the scent of pine and smoke that her wolf recognized as mate. The throne room was chaos. Nobles stumbled over each other in their rush toward the exits. Cloth pressed to their mouths and noses as greenish gas billowed from vents near the dais. Guards shouted orders that no one followed. The acrid smell burned Mira's throat even from the corridor, but she pushed forward anyway. Every instinct she'd cultivated for 2 years screamed at her to run the other way. She ran toward him instead. The gas was thicker near the throne. Mira pulled her apron up over her nose and squinted through the haze. Bodies littered the floor. Counselors who'd collapsed before reaching the doors. Guards who'd tried to help and succumbed themselves. And there, sprawled at the base of the throne with his hand clutched to his chest, was Theron. Mira dropped to her knees beside him. His eyes were open but unfocused. Blood trickled from his nose. Each breath rattled wetly in his lungs, and the sound cut through her carefully constructed walls like a blade through butter. No, she couldn't do this. Using her gift meant exposure. Questions. Becoming visible in all the ways she'd spent 2 years avoiding. Healers were valuable. Valuable things got controlled. Theron's hand fell limply to the stone floor. Mira's gift surged before she could suppress it. The instinct was too strong. Too primal, her wolf wouldn't let their mate die even if her conscious mind was still fighting the bond. Heat flooded through her palms as she pressed them to his chest. She could smell the poison in his lungs, taste it on the back of her tongue, something metallic and wrong, designed to stop the heart and collapse the airways. She pulled. The toxin came reluctantly, clinging to his tissue like oil on water. Mira gritted her teeth and dragged harder, feeling the poison transfer from his body to hers. Her gift didn't just purge it, absorbed, filtered, neutralized. For a moment, the toxin burned through her own system, and she wondered if she'd miscalculated, if saving him would kill her instead. Then her body processed it and expelled it, and Theron gasped. Air rushed back into his lungs. Color returned to his face. His amber eyes focused on her with startling clarity, and Mira realized she was still touching him. Her hands splayed across his chest where she could feel his heart hammering back to life. She tried to pull away. His hand shot up and caught her wrist. Wait. His voice was raw from the gas and something deeper. His grip was gentle but firm, and the skin-to-skin contact made her wolf keen with want. You saved my life. I did my job, Mira said flatly. You're the king, now let me go. At least let me thank you properly. She yanked her wrist free and stood. Around them, guards were beginning to recover, and she could already see the questions forming on their faces. The head cook shouldn't have a healing gift. The head cook shouldn't have been able to do what trained healers struggled with. The head cook was now very, very visible. Mira fled before anyone could stop her. She made it back to her quarters and barred the door. Then she sank to the floor with her back against the wood and tried to breathe normally. Her hands were still shaking. She could still feel the ghost of his heartbeat against her palms, still smell pine and smoke clinging to her skin. Her wolf growled low. Hours. Protect. Stay. She couldn't stay. She'd exposed herself. Tomorrow the questions would start, and she had no good answers that didn't involve revealing more secrets she couldn't afford to share. The knock came 3 hours after sunset. Mira knew it was him before she opened the door. She could smell him through the wood, that scent of pine and smoke that made her wolf surge against her thoughts like it was trying to claw its way out of her chest. She should ignore it. Pretend she was asleep. Wait for him to leave. Instead, she opened the door. Theron stood in the corridor alone. No guards. No witnesses. Just the king in simple dark clothing with exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He held his hands carefully at his sides, palms open, like he was trying to prove he wasn't a threat. "Stop me when it's too much," he murmured. The phrase felt like an offering, like he was giving her all the power between them and trusting her not to destroy him with it. "I won't claim you without permission," Theron continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't command you. I won't use my authority to force proximity, but my wolf knows you're my mate. And if there's any chance you feel this too, if there's any chance you'd let me court you properly." Mira slammed the door in his face. She leaned against it, her chest heaving like she'd run a mile. On the other side, she heard him exhale slowly, heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor, heard the careful, respectful way he left without argument or demand. Her wolf howled. Want him, need him, hours. And her heart, the part of her she'd thought Rowan had broken beyond repair, whispered the same thing. The next morning, she found him in his corner of the kitchen. Mira stopped in the doorway, staring. Theron sat on his usual stool with his correspondence spread before him, working as if the previous night had never happened, as if she hadn't rejected him, as if he hadn't just confessed that his wolf recognized her as his fated mate. He looked up when she entered. Their eyes met. "Good morning," he said quietly, and returned to his work. That was all. No pressure, no demands, no using his authority to force the conversation she clearly didn't want to have. He simply existed in her space, keeping his promise not to push while making it equally clear he had no intention of disappearing. He'll pursue her, but he'll never force her. The realization settled over Mira like a weight. This wasn't a man who would take what he wanted regardless of her consent. This was a man who would wait as long as it took, who would court her with devastating patience, who would give her every opportunity to choose him freely or walk away. That terrified her more than any command could have. Mira went about her morning routine, hyper-aware of his presence. She could feel his gaze following her movements when he thought she wasn't looking, could sense the careful restraint in the way he kept himself contained to his corner, never encroaching on her space, could smell the loneliness on him like winters settling over dying embers. When she set tea beside his papers without comment, his fingers brushed the cup and his eyes closed briefly, like the small gesture of care meant more than she could understand. That night, Mira woke to find her wolf fully awake and pacing beneath her skin, not the drowsy half-awareness she'd grown used to, but alert, active, desperate. It pressed against her thoughts with a clarity she hadn't felt since before Rowan's fists had taught her that mates were just another word for people who could break you. "Stay," her wolf commanded. "Claim, trust, ours." Mira pulled her knees to her chest and tried to silence the voice that sounded too much like hope. She was already losing the battle against the bond. 2 weeks passed, and Theron became part of the rhythm of Mira's mornings. He arrived before dawn with the same quiet consistency as the sunrise itself. Always the same corner near the hearth. Always the same leather satchel full of correspondence. Always the same careful restraint that never pushed, never demanded, never encroached on the invisible boundaries she'd drawn around herself. Mira told herself she was tolerating his presence, that she'd simply stopped fighting a battle she couldn't win without causing a scene that would draw more attention than his quiet courtship ever could. Her wolf knew better. Safe, it whispered every time his scent filled the kitchen. Ours. The emotional intimacy crept up on her so gradually, she didn't realize it was happening until it had already changed everything. It started with practical observations. Mira noticing the way Theron's shoulders curved inward when he read certain letters, the tension that gathered at the base of his skull when council business weighed on him, the way he rubbed absently at the scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Then came the small acts of service she couldn't seem to stop herself from offering. Tea placed beside his papers. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. A cushion for the wooden stool that had to be murder on his back after hours of sitting. He never thanked her aloud, but the way his amber eyes softened when he found the tea waiting told her everything. On the 9th morning, Mira broke the silence. "Why do you keep coming here?" Theron looked up from the letter he'd been reading. For a moment, he seemed to weigh how much truth he could afford to share. Then something in his expression shifted, a decision made, walls coming down. "Because you're the only person in this entire palace who doesn't want something from me." The honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. Mira's hands stilled on the dough she'd been kneading, and she found herself really looking at him for the first time since that night he'd appeared at her door. She saw past the crown, past the authority, past everything she'd been trying so hard not to see. She saw loneliness that matched her own. "The council wants your obedience," Theron continued, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear it over the morning bustle. "The nobles want your favor. The servants want to avoid your wrath. But you—" He paused, and something raw flickered across his face. "You just want me to leave you alone. And somehow that's the most honest thing anyone's offered me in 6 months." Mira should have agreed, should have reinforced the walls between them. Instead, she heard herself asking, "What about what you want?" "I want to not feel alone in rooms full of people." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and devastating. Something cracked inside Mira's chest. She recognized the shape of his isolation because she'd been living inside her own version of it for 2 years. The difference was that she'd chosen her solitude as protection. He'd had it forced on him by a crown he never wanted and a murder he couldn't prove. "Your brother," Mira said carefully. "The hunting accident. You don't believe it was an accident." Theron's jaw tightened. "No. But you can't prove it, not without evidence I don't have and allies I can't trust." His hands fisted on the papers in front of him. "So I smile at the council meetings and pretend I don't know that at least one of them wants me dead." Mira wiped the flour from her hands and crossed to the small table where she kept her tea supplies. She poured 2 cups and brought one to him. This time she didn't just leave it beside his papers. She sat down on the stool across from him. "My husband rejected me," she said. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, and she was proud of how steady her voice stayed. "Publicly. In front of his entire pack. I couldn't give him an heir fast enough, so he decided I was defective." Theron's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "I rebuilt myself here because being invisible felt safer than being seen. Because if no one looks at you, no one can decide you're not good enough." Mira wrapped her hands around her teacup, feeling the warmth seep into her calloused palms. "So I understand wanting to be alone in rooms full of people. I've been doing it for 2 years." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who'd just shown each other their wounds and found understanding instead of judgment. Over the next week, they talked. Small truths at first, then larger ones. Theron told her about Aldrich, the brother who'd ruled through fear, who'd made enemies of allies and left the kingdom fractured. He told her about the guilt of being relieved that a tyrant was dead even when that tyrant was family, about lying awake cataloging his own failures, wondering if he'd survive long enough to fix what Aldrich had broken. Mira told him about learning to suppress her omega scent, about the freedom she'd found in anonymity, about the terror of being valuable enough that people might want to use her. She didn't tell him about Rowan's fists or her shattered ribs or the noble birth she'd left behind. But she told him enough. They never touched. But the emotional intimacy was staggering, more naked than skin, more vulnerable than any physical closeness could have been. The afternoon of the hunt, Mira watched from the kitchen courtyard as the hunting party assembled. Theron sat astride a massive black stallion, and even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders. Her wolf strained toward him, uneasy for reasons Mira couldn't name. She should have paid attention to that instinct. The screaming started an hour later. Mira was elbow-deep in preparing the evening meal when Sarah burst through the doors, her face sheet white. "The king's horse. The saddle broke. There's so much blood." Mira ran. She found him in the field beyond the stables, surrounded by guards who were trying and failing to stop the bleeding from a gash across his shoulder, where he'd hit a fence post on the way down. The wound was deep enough to have nicked an artery, and his shirt was already soaked through. Mira shoved past the guards and dropped to her knees beside him. Her healing gift surged without conscious thought, and this time she didn't bother suppressing it. She pressed her hands to the wound and pulled, feeling the torn tissue knit back together under her palms, feeling his blood slow and then stop. When his eyes focused on her, amber meeting storm gray, she realized she'd cradled his head in her lap. Blood soaked through her dress, warm and sticky, but she didn't care. "You're all right," she whispered. "You're all right." Theron's hand came up slowly. He was giving her time to pull away, telegraphing the movement like he'd done that first night in her quarters. His fingers brushed her cheek with the gentleness that stole her breath. "Stop me when it's too much," he murmured. Mira didn't stop him. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, achingly slow. His hand slid into her hair, and copper-brown strands came loose from her braid to fall around both their faces. He was looking at her like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to kill him. Her wolf keened. Mine, ours, keep. She should pull away. Should remember why she'd spent 2 years building walls. Should protect herself before this went any further. But all she could think was that he'd almost died, and the terror of losing him had carved out a space in her chest she hadn't known existed. Around them, the guards had backed away to give them privacy. The afternoon sun slanted gold across the field, and Theron looked at her with such raw need that it made her ache. That night, he came to her quarters. Mira heard his footsteps in the corridor and knew, just knew what he was going to ask before he knocked. She opened the door. Theron stood with his hands at his sides and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. The bandage on his shoulder was stark white against his dark shirt. He looked like he was barely holding himself together. "Will you tell me what happened to you?" His voice cracked on the question, "Why you're so afraid of this?" Mira let him in. The decision was made before she fully understood what she was choosing. She stepped back from the doorway, and Theron entered her small quarters with the careful movements of someone trying not to take up too much space. A single candle burned on the table beside her narrow bed, casting wavering shadows across the stone walls. The silence stretched between them. Mira could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the pine and smoke scent of him mixing with the lingering aroma of bread dough on her hands. Her wolf pressed insistently against her thoughts, urging her toward him, but she held herself still. "I don't know how to talk about it," she said finally. "Then don't." Theron's voice was gentle. "Just let me sit with you." He settled onto the floor with his back against the wall, leaving the only chair for her. The gesture was so deliberate, so carefully non-threatening, that something in Mira's chest cracked a little wider. She sat down across from him, close enough to see the amber flecks in his eyes, but far enough that they weren't touching. His name was Rowan Frostborn. The words came out flat, practiced. Alpha of the Northern Pack. We were arranged when I was 22. Political alliance between our houses. Theron didn't speak. He just listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she'd forgotten was possible. I couldn't give him an heir. Mira's hands fisted in her lap. Not in the first month. Not in the first 6 months. Not in the first year. And Rowan, he needed a son to secure his claim against a rival. So when I failed to conceive, he decided I was defective. The candle flickered. Shadows danced across Theron's face, but his eyes never left hers. He rejected me publicly, in front of his entire pack, called me barren, useless, a waste of his time and his name. Mira's voice stayed steady through sheer force of will. "I thought that was the worst of it. I thought being rejected by your fated mate was the most pain a wolf could endure." She touched her jaw, feeling the thin scar hidden there. I was wrong. Saren's hands clenched, and she saw his claws emerge briefly before he forced them back. The control it took showed in the tension radiating through his entire body. He beat me badly enough to shatter 3 ribs and break my jaw, left me bleeding in the snow outside his territory borders. Mira met Theron's eyes and saw carefully leashed rage burning there. Everyone assumed I'd die. Rejected Omegas usually do. The bond breaks, the wolf goes silent, and the body just gives up. But you didn't. No. A ghost of bitter pride touched her voice. I clawed my way south, learned to suppress my scent so no one would know what I was, taught myself to live with a wolf that wouldn't speak to me, built a life where being invisible felt like freedom. The silence that followed was heavy with everything she hadn't said. The nights she'd woken screaming, the way her hands still shook sometimes when male voices rose in anger. The 2 years it had taken to feel safe in her own skin. Theron moved slowly, telegraphing every motion. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand with devastating gentleness. Then he pressed it to his chest, right over his heart. The muscle thundered against her palm. "I would never," he said, and his voice shook with an intensity that made her wolf keen. "I swear to you on my crown, on my wolf, on everything I am, I would never." Mira believed him. That was the most terrifying part. She believed him with a certainty that bypassed every defense she'd built, every lesson Rowan had beaten into her about never trusting an alpha's promises. She kissed him. The decision was instinct, pure and simple. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, and the contact sent electricity racing down her spine. Theron froze for a heartbeat, like he couldn't quite believe she'd chosen this, and then he kissed her back. Weeks of denial detonated between them. Theron's arms came around her like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to kill him, pulling her from the chair into his lap in one fluid movement. His hand slid into her hair, and copper-brown strands came loose from her braid to fall around them both. The kiss deepened, desperate and hungry and achingly gentle all at once. Mira felt his control fracture. His claws emerged, pricking through the thin fabric of her shirt, and he pulled back immediately with horror written across his face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." She caught his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. "You didn't hurt me. You won't hurt me. You don't know that." "Yes," Mira said fiercely. "I do." She kissed him again, softer this time, and felt the tension drain out of him. They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air, letting the truth of what they were to each other settle into their bones. "Stay," Mira whispered. "Just for tonight. Stay with me." Theron's arms tightened around her. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I don't want to be alone. I'm sure I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in 3 years." She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I'm sure that scares me more than anything Rowan ever did." They moved to her narrow bed, and Theron held her with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for sacred things. His forehead pressed to hers, his hand splayed across her back, keeping her close. In the candlelight, with the world narrowed down to just the 2 of them, Mira felt her wolf fully wake for the first time since the rejection. "Ours," it purred. "Safe. Home. Complete the bond with me," Theron murmured against her hair. "Let me claim you properly. Let me—" No, the word came out sharper than she intended. Mira felt him tense, felt the hurt that flashed through him, and forced herself to explain. "I need to know you want me. Not the mate fate handed you, not the Omega your wolf recognizes. Me, Mira, the broken, damaged woman who might never be able to give you heirs. You're not broken. I am." She said it without self-pity, just fact. "And I need to know you see all of me and still choose this, not because you have to, because you want to." The silence stretched. Then Theron's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers tangling together. "Tell me what you need," he whispered. "Time or space or proof, tell me what you need, and I'll give you anything but distance." Mira didn't have an answer. She just held him tighter and let herself believe, for one night, that maybe she could have this. that maybe a man who'd learned to be gentle in a world that demanded dominance, and a woman who'd learned to be strong in a world that demanded submission, could find something real together. She woke hours later, still wrapped in Theron's arms, and her wolf purred a single word. Ours. For the first time in years, Mira let herself believe that this could be real. 3 days after the night Mira told Theron everything, guards came for her in the middle of the morning shift. She was kneading bread when they appeared in the kitchen doorway. Captain Helena Stormwind led them, her expression carefully neutral, and Mira knew immediately that something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Mira of the palace kitchens," Helena said formally. "You're summoned to an emergency council session. You're to come immediately." The bread dough fell from Mira's hands. Around her, the kitchen staff had gone silent, watching with wide eyes. She wiped flour from her palms and followed without protest, but her wolf growled low in warning. Danger. Run. The council chamber was packed. Every noble house had representatives present, filling the tiered seats that rose around the central floor like a theater built for judgment. Mira was led to the center of the room and left standing alone under the weight of dozens of stares. Theron sat on the throne at the far end, and the moment their eyes met, Mira saw the trapped fury in his gaze. He hadn't called this session. He didn't know why she was here. Lord Cassius stood beside the throne, silver-gray hair perfectly groomed, distinguished face arranged in an expression of grave concern. He held a leather folder that made Mira's stomach drop. "Your Majesty, honored council," Cassius began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. "I've called this emergency session to address a threat to the crown that I can no longer, in good conscience, keep silent about." Theron's hands gripped the throne's armrests. "What threat, Cassius?" "This woman." Cassius gestured to Mira. "The one you've been allowing into your private chambers. The one who has orchestrated every assassination attempt against you for the past month." The chamber erupted. Nobles shouting questions, guards moving closer to Mira, the sound of it all crashing over her like a wave. Through the chaos, she kept her eyes on Theron and watched him go deadly still. "That's a lie," Theron said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I wish it were, Your Majesty." Cassius opened the folder with theatrical precision. "But the evidence is irrefutable. This woman is not who she claims to be." He began reading. Documentation of Mira's true identity. Lady Mirabelle Ashford of the Northern Territories. Records of her arranged mating to Alpha Rowan Frostborn. A detailed account of her public rejection and the beating that followed. Her arrival in the Ironmore Kingdom 2 years ago under false pretenses with no references and no explanation. Mira watched Theron's expression shift as each new revelation landed. She'd kept so much from him. Her noble birth, her real name. And now he was learning it all in front of his entire court, presented as evidence of deception. "She infiltrated this palace with a specific goal," Cassius continued. "To seduce and destabilize our king on behalf of her former mate, who seeks to expand his northern influence. Every assassination attempt has been carefully orchestrated to position herself as the king's savior, to bind him to her through manufactured gratitude. No." The word came out of Mira before she could stop it. "That's not true." Cassius smiled with practiced sympathy. "Then perhaps you can explain this." He produced a letter bearing Rowan's seal and began to read. The words were poison, a fabricated testimony claiming Mira's instability and manipulative nature, confirming her supposed mission to compromise the Ironmore throne. The letter detailed her history of deception and warned that she was dangerous when cornered. It was all lies. But it was convincing lies, woven with just enough truth to be devastating. The council devoured it. Mira could smell their suspicion sharpening into certainty, could see the way they looked at her with disgust and vindication. The rejected Omega had been too good to be true. Of course she'd been hiding something. "Furthermore," Cassius said quietly, "I must confess that I've been remiss in my duties. I should have reported this weeks ago, but I hoped." He paused, the picture of reluctant honesty. "I hoped that His Majesty's interest in this woman was passing, that he would see reason before his judgment became compromised." But when I learned he'd been spending nights in her quarters, the chamber exploded again. This time the outrage was directed at Theron, and Mira watched him absorb it with the same careful stillness he'd shown that first day in the kitchens. But his eyes had gone cold, calculating, trapped. "The king's judgment is compromised," Magistrate Cross declared, rising from his seat. "We must vote on this woman's fate without his interference." "She saved my life," Theron said, and there was steel beneath the quiet words. "Twice." "Exactly as she planned," Cassius replied smoothly. "Create the problem, provide the solution, bind you to her through gratitude and desire. It's a classic manipulation, Your Majesty. One I should have protected you from." The vote was called. Mira watched hands raise around the chamber guilty, arrest her, treason, and felt her wolf howl in betrayal. Not at Theron, who was fighting for her with every weapon he had, but at fate itself for dangling hope in front of her and then ripping it away. Helena appeared at her side with shackles. Their eyes met, and Mira saw something flicker in the captain's expression. Regret, maybe. Or respect. "I'm sorry," Helena murmured, low enough that only Mira could hear. Mira didn't fight. She let the shackles close around her wrists and turned to face Theron one last time. Across the chamber, past the sea of hostile nobles and triumphant council members, she found his amber gaze. She saw his anguish, his fury, his absolute helplessness. And she understood he was a king before he was her mate. Protocol and politics had him trapped as thoroughly as the shackles binding her wrists. He couldn't save her without destroying everything he was trying to protect. Mira held his gaze as the guards led her away. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't give Cassius or the council the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, her wolf screamed, and her heart shattered into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. The cell was cold stone and iron bars. The guard locked her in and left without a word. In the silence that followed, Mira sat on the narrow bench and let herself remember the feeling of Theron's arms around her, the sound of his voice murmuring promises into her hair, the way he'd looked at her like she was worth choosing. Then she began examining the cell's weaknesses, the guard rotation patterns, the lock mechanism, the distance to the council chamber where Cassius would present his final evidence at dawn. She had one night before her scheduled execution, and she wasn't going to wait for rescue. The guard outside Mira's cell was young and overworked, and by the second hour of his watch, exhaustion radiated from him like heat from coals. Mira focused her healing gift on him and reversed it. Instead of purging fatigue, she amplified it. She felt the weariness in his muscles, the weight pulling at his eyelids, and she pushed. His breathing deepened. His head drooped. Within minutes, he collapsed against the wall in sleep so deep he wouldn't wake for hours. She picked the lock with a hairpin she'd straightened against the stone floor. 2 years working in the palace meant she knew every servant's passage, every shortcut, every route that avoided the main corridors where guards patrolled. Dawn was breaking when she reached the council chamber. Through the heavy oak doors, she could hear Cassius's voice carrying smoothly through his final performance. Mira pushed the doors open. Every head turned. The chamber fell silent except for Cassius's voice trailing off mid-sentence. Mira's eyes found Theron immediately. He sat on the throne looking hollowed out and barely holding together. And when he saw her, hope and terror warred across his face. She didn't go to him. She walked straight toward Cassius. "You want to talk about treason?" Her voice rang clear through the chamber, and she watched Cassius's expression shift from surprise to calculation. "Let's talk about the poison you've been feeding the king, the documents you forged, the murder you arranged." Cassius laughed. The sound was warm, indulgent, perfectly pitched to make her seem hysterical. The condemned woman returns with wild accusations. How desperate. He reached casually for the wine goblet on the council table, his signature gesture of confidence, the image of a man utterly untroubled by the ravings of a prisoner who'd somehow escaped her cell. Mira's healing gift surged. She could smell everything in that moment. The wine, the wood of the table, the fear starting to rise from the nobles in the gallery. And beneath it all, sharp and metallic, the scent of poison coming from Cassius's ring. The same toxin that had nearly killed Theron twice, the same poison that had stopped King Aldrich's heart during a hunting trip. She pulled. Healers close wounds. They purge toxins from bodies and restore balance to broken systems. But Mira had learned in that cell that her gift could work in reverse. She could amplify exhaustion into unconsciousness, and she could pull poison from where it was stored and force it into living tissue. The poison resisted. It wanted to stay in its concealed vial, safe inside Cassius's ornate ring. But Mira dragged it free with the same force she'd used to purge gas from Theron's lungs. She felt the toxin transfer from metal to skin, felt it burn through Cassius's carefully maintained defenses. He gasped. The wine goblet fell from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. What? Cassius stumbled backward, clutching his chest. His distinguished face contorted, all that practiced charm dissolving into panic. What have you done? Given you a taste of your own medicine. Mira's voice stayed steady even as the effort of using her gift like this made her legs shake. That's the same poison you used on King Aldrich, the same poison you've used on Theron twice now, and you've been carrying it this entire time. Cassius collapsed to his knees. Around them, the council erupted into chaos. But Mira kept her eyes on the man who'd orchestrated 3 years of her suffering. The man who'd brokered her mating to Rowan, profited from her pain, and then tried to use her again to isolate Theron. You arranged everything, she said. My first mating, the assassination attempts, all of it to keep the king alone and controllable. Cassius tried to speak, tried to maintain his composure, but the poison was working through his system faster than he could fight it. His control shattered, and the truth spilled out of him like blood from a wound. The word came out strangled. I killed Aldrich, arranged your mating, manufactured the evidence, all of it. He gasped for air, his cold blue eyes finding hers with hatred. I needed him isolated, needed him weak. You ruined everything. Magistrate Cross was on his feet. Guards, get the palace healers. No healers can reverse this, Mira said quietly. I made sure of it. Cassius collapsed fully, his breathing growing labored. Poisoned the king, forged the documents, killed anyone who might give him strength. Each confession came harder than the last, witnessed by every noble in the kingdom. Wanted the power, needed the control. All of it, everything. Then he went still. Mira's legs gave out. She felt the floor rushing up to meet her, felt her gift finally exhausting itself after reversing its nature for too long. But before she hit the marble, strong arms caught her. Theron. He didn't ask permission. Didn't whisper warnings about how much was too much. He just held her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. And Mira felt the incomplete bond between them singing with relief and anguish and desperate need. You're alive, he murmured against her hair. You're alive and you're here, and you just saved the kingdom. Magistrate Cross finished, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence. She just saved us all. Mira's eyes closed. She could hear the council erupting into arguments, could feel Theron's arms tightening around her, could sense her wolf pressing urgently against her thoughts. But exhaustion dragged her under before she could tell him any of the things that mattered. When she woke, soft afternoon light filled an unfamiliar room. Rich tapestries hung on stone walls. A fire crackled in an ornate hearth. And beside the bed where she lay, Theron sat in a chair pulled close enough that his hand could rest over hers. His eyes were red-rimmed. His black hair stood in wild peaks like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. And when he saw her eyes open, the expression that crossed his face was so raw it made her chest ache. You could have died, he said hoarsely. You could have. Mira pulled him down to her. Stop me when it's too much, Mira whispered, throwing his words back at him with a smile that held every emotion she'd kept buried for years. Then she bit him. Her teeth found the junction where his neck met his shoulder, and she felt the exact moment her wolf surged forward to make the mark permanent. The claiming bite was instinct and choice and magic all at once. Copper and pine flooded her senses, mixing with the taste of Theron's skin and the sharp metallic tang of blood. The bond slammed into place with a force that tore a cry from both their throats. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't subtle. 2 years of suppressed emotion. His crushing loneliness, her bone-deep fear, the aching want they both tried so hard to deny, flooded through the connection like a dam breaking. Mira felt Theron's isolation, as if it were her own, felt the way he'd convinced himself he had to bear everything alone, felt the exact moment her presence in his life had made the emptiness recede. And he felt her. The trauma that had silenced her wolf, the terror of trusting anyone with that much power over her heart, the slow, terrifying realization that she was falling despite every wall she'd built. Theron's arms came around her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. His hand slid into her hair, cradling her head against him as she completed the claiming mark. When she finally pulled back, his amber eyes were glowing with his wolf rising close to the surface. "My turn," he murmured, and there was wonder in his voice. "Stop me when it's too much." Mira tilted her head, exposing her throat in a gesture of absolute trust. "You never gave me too much. You gave me exactly enough time to remember how to be brave." His bite was gentle, even in his desperation. She felt his control holding despite the bond screaming at him to claim, to mark, to complete what they'd started. His teeth found the mirror image of where she'd marked him, and the magic completed itself. The world exploded into sensation. The incomplete bond had been like seeing through fog, aware of each other, but unable to truly connect. This was clarity. This was wholeness. Mira felt Theron's relief crash through her, felt his wolf finally settle after months of restless agitation, felt the way he'd been holding himself together by sheer will, and how close he'd come to breaking. And he felt her healing, her wolf fully awake and singing with joy, her fear finally silenced by the proof that this man, this king, this mate, had chosen patience over possession and waited until she was ready. They held each other as the bond settled, learning its new language. Mira could sense Theron's emotions now, not reading his mind, but feeling the shape of what he carried, the weight of the crown, the guilt over his brother, the fierce protectiveness he felt for her that made his wolf growl every time he remembered Cassius's accusations. "I can feel you," Theron whispered against her hair. "Everything you are, everything you've survived. I feel you too." Mira's fingers traced the claiming mark on his neck, and she felt his wolf purr at her touch. "You're not alone anymore. Neither are you." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the rich tapestries and polished stone. Outside the windows, afternoon was fading into evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. But Mira barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the man holding her and the bond thrumming between them. "You never stopped me," Theron murmured, and she could hear the wonder in his voice, could feel his amazement through the bond. "You never asked for too much." Mira pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "Even when your wolf was screaming to claim me, even when waiting must have cost you everything, you gave me the choice. It was always yours to make." His thumb brushed her cheek with devastating gentleness. "I would have waited forever if that's what you needed. I know." That was the truth that had finally broken through her walls. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but the quiet proof that he meant every word he whispered. "That's why I'm ready now." They stayed tangled together as night fell, whispering the things they'd been too afraid to say before. Theron told her about the nights he'd lain awake after leaving her quarters, fighting his wolf's demand to go back, to claim, to complete the bond. Mira confessed that she'd started falling the first morning he'd appeared in her kitchen, when he'd chosen loneliness over forcing his presence where it wasn't wanted. "I love you," Theron said finally, the words simple and devastating. "Not because fate decided you're my mate, because you're fierce and brave, and you never let anyone make you small. Because you saved my life and then refused to let me claim you until I'd proven I wanted you for you." Mira's throat tightened. Through the bond, she could feel the truth of it, not the desperate need of an incomplete bond, but the deep, steady certainty of a choice made and meant. I love you, she whispered back. Because you could have commanded and you asked. Because you made yourself gentle in a world that demands dominance. Because you gave me time to remember how to be brave. Outside, the palace bells began to ring, not an alarm, but a celebration. The council had made their announcement. Cassius's conspirators had been arrested. The kingdom was finally safe. And inside these chambers, two people who'd spent years convinced they had to face the world alone learned what it meant to be whole. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Theron growled low, his arms tightening around Mira protectively, and she felt his wolf bristle at the interruption. Your Majesty. Captain Helena's voice carried through the wood. The council requests your presence. They're ready to formally clear Mira's name and address the succession of power. 6 months after the coronation, Mira woke to find Theron already awake, watching her with the soft contentment that had become as familiar as breathing. You're staring again, she murmured, but there was no reproach in it. Through the bond, she could feel his quiet joy, the way mornings like this still amazed him after years of waking alone. I'm allowed to appreciate my mate. Mira smiled and stretched, feeling the warmth of sunlight streaming through the windows of their shared chambers. The palace had changed in half a year, not in its stones or its tapestries, but in the way it felt. The weight of conspiracy and isolation had lifted, replaced by something lighter, cleaner. The bond hummed between them, settled and comfortable. She could sense Theron's emotions without effort, the way he was already running through the day's challenges in his mind, the slight tension gathering in his shoulders as he thought about the trade negotiations scheduled for this afternoon. Come on, Mira said, rising from the bed. We have a tradition to maintain. They met in the kitchens where it all began, just as they did every dawn. Sarah had long since stopped being surprised to find the king and queen sitting at the small table in the corner, sharing tea in comfortable silence. This morning, she just smiled and went about her work. The magistrate is pushing back on the new Omega protection laws, Theron said quietly, wrapping his hands around his cup. He thinks they're too radical. Then we remind him that radical changes happen when people stop accepting cruelty as tradition. Mira took a sip of her tea. I'll speak with him this afternoon. The court had learned to respect their queen, not because she'd married their king, but because she'd broken out of a cell and exposed a traitor with nothing but her gift and her will. Because she had a strategic mind that cut through political maneuvering like a knife through butter. Because she refused to tolerate injustice, even when it made powerful nobles uncomfortable. In the garden later that morning, they walked together through the early spring blooms. Mira could sense old fear trying to creep back into her thoughts, the instinct that whispered she didn't belong here, that someone would realize she was just a rejected Omega playing at queen. Theron's hand found hers without her having to ask. Thank you for not stopping me, he murmured, the phrase that had become their private reminder of how they'd begun. Mira smiled. Thank you for asking. The kingdom had changed under their rule. Trade agreements were honored. Rejected Omegas had legal protections for the first time in generations. The council had learned that their king would not be manipulated, and their queen would not be dismissed. But more than policy or politics, the palace itself had transformed. Servants moved through the halls without fear. Laughter echoed from the training yards. And every morning, the king and queen met in the kitchens where a lonely alpha had once asked for permission to simply exist in the presence of a woman who'd sworn never to trust again. They'd both sacrificed their isolation, the armor they'd built to survive. But they'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a partner who chose them every single day, not because fate demanded it, but because love asked and they answered. I never thought I'd have this, Theron said quietly, watching the sun rise over their kingdom, someone who shares the weight instead of adding to it. Neither did I. Mira leaned into him, feeling the bond sing with contentment. But here we are. Here we are, he agreed. And every dawn after, they met in the kitchens where it all began, sharing tea in comfortable silence. Two people who'd learned that the strongest bonds are the ones we choose every single day. Thank you so much for listening to Mira and Theron's story. If you loved their journey from loneliness to love, I'd be honored if you'd leave a comment telling me your favorite moment, or hit that follow button for more romance stories. There are so many more tales waiting to be told, stories of fated mates, hidden identities, and love that conquers every obstacle. Sometimes the most powerful question we can ask is not, "Will you?" but "May I?" And the bravest answer is always yes.